Hello, and welcome to this podcast series celebrating the 30th anniversary of the National Fairground and Circus Archive. In this episode, Andrew talks to Joanna Whittle, a painter who works directly with landscape and archival sources and collections. Joanna is a member of the Contemporary British Painting Society and shows work extensively nationally and internationally. She is strongly committed to research, collaboration, and engagement. Her landscape paintings consider fragility and transience in the landscape through small-scale paintings of fairground architecture and circus tents, which create makeshift and unsettling worlds. Here, temporary structures sit secretly in empty landscapes, lights gleaming under grey skies in spaces of silence, where the entertainment exists only as a temporary segment of these worlds before they sink back into quietness. Joanna studied at Central St Martin's and the Royal College of Art. Her work deploys material and illusory qualities of paint in an exploration of both real and imagined landscapes. The subjects are an enactment of romantic notions of the ruin with decaying structures and verdigrised surfaces. However, the buildings and sites are more contemporaneous, and the paintings often contain signifiers suggesting ongoing, furtive activity. Her tent paintings represent fragile and temporary structures constructed within these notions of the ruin and time passing. The overanxious handling of the subject matter is almost forensic. Each element is studied and exposed. But equally, elements give way to fluid and rough rendering to undermine this certainty. The paintings are on a small or miniature scale, making these worlds more focused and intense. They are not bodily landscapes, but rather operate as small hallucinations or worlds running concurrently or beneath reality, formed by minute perceptions.
Hi, Joe. I wonder if you could tell me what your link to the archive is.
Well, I started working with the archive when Aranza, the collections manager, invited me to apply for a research project, and that was because my paintings were focusing on circus tents and fairground equipment, and it seemed like a really natural match. So, I came in and met with Aranza, and we looked at putting together a project grant, which we did. So we put together an Arts Council project grant together to fund a period of research with an exhibition. And we were successful in that. So in 2022, I started my period of research. And as you know, asked you lots of information, Andrew, and you worked with me on that research, which was brilliant. And you kind of really elucidated the archive for me. And then the exhibition was opened on the 23rd in June 2023 and continued to the end of the year. So, I've had quite an intense period with the archive, a lot of research, a lot of pulling together archival source material for the exhibition and for the production of new paintings, drawings, sound recordings. It really opened up a new world for me in terms of my practice, which went beyond painting. So that's my initial connection and my ongoing connection, really.
Could you tell me or share some of your thoughts about the archive? What does it represent to you?
Well, originally it represented to me this idea, I thought, well, this is going to be a brilliant project. I'm just going to find lots of pictures of tents or fairground equipment that's going to inspire me to make more paintings, just really as source material. But as I started to get involved in the project and learn a lot more about showman history, I realized that the project was expanding and becoming more about that as well, and these moments that exist outside the structures within the fairground and the circus. So it kind of expanded and expanded. But I think the archive in that sense is a place of discovery. You might come to the archive with this idea that you're going to find one thing and then you find another thing. And I think it's to do with the skill as well of, you and people who work there who have a sort of love and an understanding of this knowledge and are able to share that, and this kind of thread unravels and you go on this journey. So but to me it kind of represents this change in my work and this dialogue between painting, but everything that exists outside the painting, because my paintings are empty and unpeopled. So it's almost as if the engagement with the archive was really about those other spaces, the spaces that aren't seen in my paintings, and kind of inhabit them invisibly, if that makes any sense. But it's also, source material, and it's about information, and it's about the community, and it's about information that can be shared and the accessibility of information in history. And also, I learned so much about showman culture that I would never have known, if I just was using it as kind of bare pictorial source material. So, yeah, it represents a lot to me.
Can you give me any examples of how the thread unravelled for yourself?
I can think really of the Cyril Critchlow collection, for example, and I was looking for kind of images of Sanger. They had some images of Sanger, and then I unraveled, and I kind of unraveled a family history right from kind of early letters from the kind of Sanger family to each other, and postcards, and bringing that all the way up through to the 80s of young John Sanger, and how this whole kind of family history arced through these really intimate letters between people, and just a very long correspondence between John and his auntie, and the dissolution of the kind of Sanger family, and war, and all of the things that happen in one family history. You pull at one thing that's quite interesting, and then you're following it and following it. And, as you know, I probably spent a lot more time at the archive than originally put into my Arts Council grant, because it was I needed to know, and then that connected to another collection and another collection, and then these all kind of weave back in together to inform the paintings. Kind of depth of knowledge that I didn't have before. And obviously, there's some really interesting collections that we'll talk about later. The Bob Chase collection, which became a really big part of the project.
So, how do you think that the archive is significant in society or academia or in art or the showman community? And can you give me an example of how it was significant to yourself?
Again, while I was building the project, so I'm coming as an artist. But there's so many threads. So for example, I worked with academics. I worked with Vanessa, the founder of the archive. I worked with Stephen Walker, who wrote books on architecture. But it was really about bringing people together. I worked with Sheldon Chadwick, who then went on afterwards to have a show. So he's a sixth generation showman. I learned so much from him through looking at archival material. From that project, I brought Sheldon to meet with the Society of Explorers, which is a young person's production company working from Site Gallery. So they started to understand what it would be like to be a young showman. Then I brought Stephen and Sheldon together. So it's about pulling all of these together. So in a way, you don't segregate academia from community, from showman, because it becomes part of the one conversation. And the artist as alchemist, or whoever, but pulling it together, through engaging with the archive and looking in different ways. And that's what became important to me, this kind of democratization of information to be used by so many different sources. I also brought students in, theatre students, loads of different groups visited, to use the archive in a different way. Sadaka, the African Caribbean Association, working with their archivists to talk, about archives and what they do and how they serve their communities and wider communities. So to me, archive is something that I work wider with other archives to kind of bring that information to the community, and it should be used by the community, because it's their information, it's our history. Being funded by the Arts Council kind of validates that, and validates that use of archive, and the importance of the project of working with archive. And also the National Archive highlighted it as the best kind of engagement project in that year. So it was really about engagement with me. And I think it's funny for me because I'm such a private miniature painter that spends hours in a dark studio. It was kind of like a translation of everything that I'm thinking about while I'm painting, to be able to kind of move through the archive with people, with people along with me. I think that's what was a really beautiful part of it, and how many people came to the archive as a result of the project.
I can remember when you started working on the project, you had a number of articles, a number of things in mind, and then it's like you embarked on a journey and you started to explore and expand and discover. And I suppose it can almost be exponential the way that the archive can lead to different possibilities, I suppose. How did you manage to deal with the fact that there were so many possibilities? How did you manage to focus?
I kind of because I think the way my brain works as well, it goes like this, it goes everywhere. And I kind of, I thought I should focus. And, in one way, when you focus on a project, you kind of get deeper onto one theme. But for me, it became more about the actual process of inhabiting an archive and the fact that it is all these multiple pieces of information which communicate with each other. So, for example, I found the Bob Chase archive really early on, on my third time or my second time, and then that expanded into such a massive part of the project. With the Bob Chase archive, the photos being taken in 1978, me and Bob returning to the King's Lynn Mart in 2023, meeting people from the photographs, interviewing people from the photographs, bringing them in touch with their heritage, naming people in the archive. So that was like a dream of making the archive contemporary, making the archive relevant to the community it's talking about. So I went with that, but I also went with the Bramwell Taylor collection and these love stories, and I went with Sanger's writing to his aunties, and I went with the Orton and Spooner collection, and I went with the Vic King films. And the reason I went with all of these things, and you saw in the curation of the exhibition, is that they all talk to each other. There's these overlaps and these sort of conversations and these whispered conversations between material. So to kind of try and segregate that whole history and this kind of the history of showmen and the circus and people working today, and I really wanted to see that journey and all the kind of myriad connections that were made. So I think you'd move from one cabinet to another display case and you'd see something which echoed some kind of thread between them. So that's what I found so beautiful in the curation and the selection of material to show alongside my own work.
This sort of leads us on to the next question because I was supposed to ask you, was there a collection or a theme in the archive which had a really specific impact on you? But it sounds like lots of them did.
Yeah.
Can you focus on perhaps one of them? You talked about the Bob Chase and just like detail, sort of step by step, what happened as part of that process.
For me, they were really kind of interesting images because they're black and white images and they're monochrome. And obviously, my paintings are very much about light and this kind of luminosity, these kind of, well, the lights of the fairground, which are color. And Bob chose to deliberately photograph the showman in black and white to kind of get beyond this facade of color and light and what the audience sees or engages with. So I kind of found that beautiful. Just these beautiful structures of stores and tents and things. So that was fascinating for me. And then you put me in touch with Bob, and me and Bob met. So when we did go down to King's Lynn, and I said, "Well, I'm going to go down." He said, "Oh, I'll come." And we wanted to find the people in the photos because, bearing in mind, showman communities continue to visit the same place and work in the same place through generations. So the Corn Exchange allowed us to screen the photos. Then me and Bob went down the week before and kind of harassed showmen. Harassed might not be the right word. But spoke to showmen about the project and invited them. And obviously they're so busy. It's the peak time in the mart. But they did come. Kind of, it was really moving because there was people there who was there was one showman who saw a picture of his dad that he'd never seen. His dad died when he was 6, so we were seeing these pictures of his dad as a young man. And then what Bob did was he set up the Google Drive so people could keep adding names. So we had this beautiful conversation ongoing where people were sharing it on Facebook, through the QR code and adding names to the archive. That was actually really moving, but it came back to my paintings as well because then I was using Bob Chase imagery to layer. So I was using his kind of black and white photos, but then new pictures of the King's Lynn Mart in 2023, the 818th King's Lynn Mart, and layering these to create these composite works, which is how I work anyway with archive or with any source material. But it was amazing as well to be able to interview showmen that were in the photos, and talk to them, and that's now part of the permanent collection. So it's amazing to have my own collection in the archives as well, which is brilliant, and to have their voices heard. And so often if you listen to those interviews, they thanked me and they thanked us and they thanked the archive for preserving history. there was some really interesting conversation. So again, just coming from these Bob Chase photographs about the struggles showmen are suffering, the price of diesel, less numbers because people have other things to do in their phones, so all of these kind of, talking about the environment, talking about stress, business, too many emails, that we're all suffering. So it's really interesting to have those contemporary conversations that come from some black and white photos that I encountered one day, in an archive in Sheffield. So that's what I love. But there were so many beautiful moments in the archive. I followed this theme of horses, and again, Bob Chase was taking pictures of the showman taking down the carousel rides. And then horses moved through, and I was finding pictures of horses and John Sanger and all his gambling and all his little horse betting diaries, and weather, because he wrote the weather down every day and how much the weather means to showmen in terms of business and industry. So it was just all of these collections constantly communicating with him. And then I focused on five, the Vic King films, Bramwell Taylor, Critchlow, Bob, and just put them all in conversation with each other. And Orton and Spooner, the original, these 19th century rides. You can pull out one collection, but actually, I've felt like I had all these little juggling these all balls that were in the air, kind of mesmeric collections, kind of vibrating with each other, which I found really beautiful. And then I had my trolley where it just kind of stayed on there, and I was shuffling the boxes, having them talk to each other, really.
It was lovely to see this. I mean, working at the archive, I'm enthused about the collections myself. So I like to try and like share that, you know, enthusiasm with the people. And you straight away seem to kind of pick it up and run with it and take it to a different level. So it was like so exciting to for me to see that really. I learnt a lot from you as well. Also, when you talked about the showman community, it was like fantastic to see them to be able to acknowledge that, but also to add back to it as part of the project. Can you describe some of your interactions with the showmen? How they felt, how they made you feel?
Well, they're a community that's, suffers prejudice. And I think this idea of transience is always suspicious to settled society. So they suffer that kind of prejudice. And actually, I was down for a show. I was showing at a gallery in King's Lynn, and I was speaking to someone who was complaining about the King's Lynn Mart, a resident, and I was trying to be really calm, and I was very calm. But it was brilliant to have done this project to talk about facts, to talk about these things, and that this man was upset because they lost their car park for 10 days. And I was like, you're talking about a car park, and I'm talking about 800 years of history. Do you know? So it was good to engage with that. The showmen, at first they were busy, but as they gradually came in to the Corn Exchange and started to see these pictures more and more, they were taking turns because everyone was looking after each other's rides. And I remember Nipper Appleton saying, look after her, she's looking after our history. And there was a real warmth and kind of love and generosity and sharing. So I really enjoyed it. And I was there at night hanging around on the stalls with them and just seeing what things they're doing and just chatting away. It was just, really, really nice time. And I felt really engaged, and I felt that they respected me and the archive, for what it's doing.
So you've been talking quite a lot about the King's Lynn Mart. We should perhaps like elucidate a little bit about what that actually is.
It's the oldest fair in the country. So when I went, it was the 818th. Nipper had just become the head steward because his predecessor had retired. The whole town is built around that history. So, as Nipper was telling me, the flagstones are thicker because the weight of the wagons would have cracked the flagstones. So the market is built to accommodate the showman. It's written into the charter and into the legislation. That's where the Showman's Guild really evolved from, because it was this idea. And again, I talk about a suspicion of transience. They didn't want the travelling fair. They didn't want travelling people in the town. So that's when the Showman Guild formed to protect the right to travel and protect those rights. So historically, it's the most important fair. It's also the first fair of the season. It's a kind of marker for how the season will go often. So if King's Lynn Mart isn't looking good, then it might, foretell of how the rest of the year is going to go in terms of business and trade. But obviously, because it's held in February on Valentine's Day, it's often snowing and it was really cold. So you've got that idea of, the fairground, but actually it's in winter. it's a very interesting place. Again, when I was talking to Professor Stephen Walker and some of his writing on fairground architecture, it's this idea as well of a fairground being within a town in the centre rather than out on a field or somewhere where it can be kept safe and away from the public. It's kind of pressing up against the boundaries of this market square. And that's why it was nice to work with the Corn Exchange, because they were basically engaging with that dialogue of prejudice actually, and saying, well, what can we do about this? We want to unify it, and as the Corn Exchange, we want to have that conversation. So it was interesting, but yeah. So the Mart is incredibly important in the showman calendar in history.
As you say, that when I first started cataloguing that Bob Chase photographic collection, I didn't know anything about the contents of that. I managed to work out just by doing a few searches on Google that it was in King's Lynn, but didn't know any more than that. And you've brought so much more to it, that collection. It was just lovely to see the Showman community adding their own back into the collection. That was how did you feel about seeing that they're talking about their family and adding more information back into the archive?
Well, I think, as I say, it's that idea of a living archive, and the archive being alive. These old photos from the 70s, they're alive, and they're alive in our own family histories when we go through photographs. But, because there was a chat box, where people would be adding comments and they'd say, oh, that's Perry. And then someone would only know someone by a nickname, and they'd say, no, no, this is his proper name, and it's from this family, and that's cousin to so and so. It was just amazing to see these kind of lineages and heritages evolving, and the kind of sweetness. And John Green, who I interviewed, and he's fourth or fifth generation, and the pictures of him in the archive were of him as a little boy, a young lad with his sister. He was like, "Oh, that's me and my sister," and it was just so nice. And then he was talking about his son, coming up on the Mart, and it was just such a tenderness of it, a tenderness of family history that we have in our own families, and a kind of seeing those kind of intimate little conversations, and connections was really beautiful. And Bob Chase has, kind of showman connections himself. He's somehow connected, I think it's the Ropers. So that's really interesting as well. And it's interesting even that he chose to do the project in the first place, because the history of him doing that project was he took the photos for his show at Harrow. He was studying photography, as you know, and they didn't think it was good enough, and they kind of failed him because of his subject matter. And then his colleagues, the other students rallied around him, and he got regraded. But it's this idea that he, as someone from King's Lynn, and knowing that history, thought it was valuable as well, and this wouldn't happen without him, recognizing that value as a young man in the 70s.
I see it almost as to me as like I don't know if it's the right word to describe it, but almost like the holy grail of getting the community who is depicted in your collections, or it's getting them to actually curate and to share their history through those collections, isn't it?
Yeah, it was amazing. Really amazing. Couldn't really have asked for more with that project, to bring the past to the present and have that conversation, and creating more archive, basically creating new content, this continuing conversation. It's really, really beautiful. But also, I guess I want to talk about the talks that we did during the exhibition. And so Sheldon Chadwick, in conversation with me, and me and Sheldon talked so much about landscape. So what I wanted to talk to Sheldon about was not kind of all the things that people might normally want to talk about the fairground. I was talking about landscape and transience and ghosting of the space and weather, and these kind of really intimate moments with landscape, but also memorial and mourning, and how showmen mourn in transience, and how the rides become so much a part of this relationship of family and heritage and mourning. So that was beautiful. And we were able to talk to it. My nephew was there, and he said, I didn't know what a showman was. And he's a young man who now knows, and that Sheldon's his hero. And he kept seeing him in the library researching when he was being able to bring that. And then Sheldon talking to Stephen Walker about architecture, and Bob Chase. And we had this whole panel of discussion between community members, artists, showman Sheldon, and Bob Chase, and this real, and that understanding that it's a kind of holistic, you a holistic thing, and this way that all of these things can cross over and become part of the same conversation. It was really beautiful.
You should talk a little bit about your artwork that was inspired by the collections as well, shouldn't you, in the Ghosted Ground exhibition?
Yeah, I forgot about the artwork. Well, I did a lot of drawing. So I actually did a lot of drawing from the Bramwell Taylor collection and these handbills, these sort of 19th century handbills. And, I'm really interested in the reflection of culture within Showman heritage. And these handbills were very much of the time and what was fashionable. And what was fashionable was the wilderness and the Alps and all these new discoveries and people kind of going around on holiday. And also the idea that showmen went on holiday and then took pictures of the kind of things they were talking about in the posters. And it was all this kind of loop. So I did quite a lot of ink drawings. And as I say, I did the Bob Chase ones where I was layering two different times, which I do a lot in my work. Um, and looking at rides, the Vic King collection inspired a lot as well. That's so beautiful, those films. And, obviously you really helped me with that lovely spreadsheet you've done, Andrew. And I was looking for rides. But yeah, so those kind of collections inspired that and Orton and Spooner and some of the shrines that I did in response to, memorialization. So a lot of the paintings, it was almost like, each cabinet had a conversation, but I really enjoyed, doing the ghost trains. And again, painting Nipper Appleton's ghost train, which appeared again and again in the archive. And that was one thing I really loved was looking for a structure. So finding a ghost train and seeing a photograph of it in the 70s and seeing a photograph of it in the 80s and the 90s and how much it's changed, and Nipper still has that ghost train that he had in those pictures from the 70s, so it's funny, and that's what inspired those paintings, those layers, and to see. And this is, what I love about the fairground is this structure moves through history and it changes and it evolves, still evolves with fashion. There's a funny bit with Nippers when it had octopuses on it, so Under the Sea must have been really fashionable. So it's just amazing, amazing. That's what inspired the work, really, that movement.
So, my final question would be, I was wondering, what do you see as the future for the archive? Where do you see it going?
I think it will continue to expand in terms of, I know there's, more and more information will come, but it's actually more about how people will engage with it and how people will choose to engage with it. I brought as many people in as possible, and so many people, different artists, different communities, different groups said, didn't we didn't think this was here. And that's the thing. It's about breaking that idea down that the archive is for academia, because actually it's again and again I talk about democratization of archives and it being for the people. And I think the Fairground archive really has something there for people to engage with. So that's what I see its future as, and I think you and Aranza both do a really wonderful job of continuing to engage with artists and interesting people, which will explore the archive and elucidate it and translate or interpret it, so that people can see what it's for and why it's there.
Just finally, what do you think the future might be for you and in terms of working with the archive?
Well, for me, there's collections that I think of that I think, okay, that's I've been so busy making work for other shows, but when I have that time of peace to go back to collections I was interested in, that I had to sort of stop the project from becoming too enormous at the time. But there's certain collections I want to go back to, the Bramwell Taylor collections, and Orton and Spooner. So yeah, there's collections. Though I still use it, I actively use the archive, the digital archive all the time. So still going.
Wonderful to hear, and as I said before, it's like music to my ears because it's great when I see that people like yourself just really get into it, enjoy it as much as I enjoy working with it. So thank you very much again for all the work you did on the project and for speaking to us today as well.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, and thanks, for Ransom for inviting me, but also, all the help you gave me, Andrew, and support to access collections and information, and your enthusiasm for the collections. That really inspired me. So it's been really, really nice to talk to you again today.
Thank you for listening. For more information on the archive, please visit the University of Sheffield website at www.sheffield.ac.uk.